For more than a century, the origin of the Kurds seemed settled. They spoke an Iranian language. They lived in the mountains between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And the textbooks placed them firmly within the Indo-European family tree, descendants of the ancient Medes, who toppled Assyria in 612 BC. It was clean. It was simple. And then geneticists opened the forbidden chapter, and nothing about that story survived. Because when researchers finally extracted DNA from the oldest known farmers in the Kurdish mountains, the genome that came back did not match anything in the Indo-European world. It matched a population that had separated from the rest of Eurasia more than 50,000 years ago. And the question it raised was not where the Kurds came from. It was, how did we get their origins so completely wrong? To understand that, you have to see how convincing the old story was. Kurdish belongs to the northwestern branch of the Iranian language family. Linguistically, it sits alongside Balochi and Persian, all descended from Old Iranian, carried westward by migrating tribes from the Central Asian steppe. The Medes, who built an empire from their capital at Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, around 727 BC, spoke a language closely related to Kurdish. The connection seemed obvious. The Kurdish national anthem still declares, "We are the children of the Medes and Kai Khosrow." Kurdish satellite television was named Med TV. The Kurdish calendar starts in 612 BC, the year the Medes sacked Nineveh, and there was physical evidence to support it. The R1A1 haplogroup, a Y chromosome lineage strongly associated with Indo-European expansion from the steppe, does appear in Kurdish populations. It accounts for roughly 12% of Kurdish male lineages. That number was enough for decades to anchor the Medes theory in genetic as well as linguistic soil. But here is the detail that should have troubled everyone. 12% is not a majority. It is not even close. Among Sorani Kurds in northeastern Iraq, a study published in BMC Genomics in 2022 typed 162 males and found the dominant paternal lineage was not R1A1, it was J2 at 28%, followed by R1B at nearly 17%. Then came haplogroup I at nearly 17%. The lineage that was supposed to define Kurdish origins, R1A1, ranked fourth. J2 is not a step marker. It is one of the oldest lineages in the Fertile Crescent. It is associated with the spread of agriculture, with Neolithic settlements, with communities that were farming barley and herding goats thousands of years before any Indo-European speaker set foot in the Zagros. And it is the single most common paternal line among Kurdish men. So how did the Medes theory hold for so long? 3 mechanisms, stacked on top of each other, kept the real picture hidden. First, linguistics dominated the field. For most of the 20th century, the origin of a people was inferred from the origin of their language. Kurds speak Iranian, therefore Kurds are Iranian. This logic was rarely questioned, even though history is full of examples where populations adopted entirely new languages without changing their genetic makeup. The Turks of Anatolia speak a Turkic language imported from Central Asia, yet genetically they are overwhelmingly Anatolian, descended from the same ancient populations they supposedly replaced. The same pattern appears across North Africa, where Berber populations adopted Arabic while retaining pre-Arab genetic profiles. Language replacement through elite dominance is one of the most common events in human history, but that nuance was almost never applied to the Kurds. Second, the political fragmentation of Kurdistan made systematic genetic study nearly impossible. Kurdish populations are divided across 4 nation-states, each with its own restrictions on research, its own bureaucratic barriers, its own political narrative about who the Kurds are and where they belong. Turkey for decades denied Kurdish identity altogether. Iran folded the Kurds into its broader national mythology. Iraq and Syria had their own agendas. No single study could sample comprehensively across the entire Kurdish homeland. Researchers worked with small, isolated data sets, 29 individuals from Georgia here, 53 from eastern Turkey there, 20 from western Iran. Each study illuminated a fragment. None could see the whole mosaic. Third, and most critical, the ancient DNA revolution had not yet reached the Zagros. Until 2016, no one had sequenced the genome of a Neolithic individual from the Eastern Fertile Crescent. The assumption was that the first farmers of the Zagros were genetically similar to the first farmers of Anatolia, the ones who colonized Europe. It was a reasonable assumption. They lived in the same broad region. They domesticated some of the same crops and animals. It was also completely wrong. In 2016, a team led by paleogeneticist Joachim Berger at the University of Mainz published a landmark paper in the journal Science. They had partnered with Iranian archaeozoologist Marjan Mashkour at the CNRS in Paris, and Feraydun Biglari, a prehistoric archaeologist at the National Museum of Iran. Together, they extracted DNA from 4 individuals buried in the Zagros Mountains, dating to approximately 10,000 years ago, from sites on the border of modern Iran and Iraq, the core of the Kurdish homeland. The process itself was painstaking. Ancient DNA degrades over millennia, fragmenting into tiny pieces, contaminated by soil bacteria and the DNA of every archaeologist who ever touched the bone. The team isolated the densest portion of the petrous bone, the hardest bone in the human body, tucked deep inside the skull behind the ear. This is where ancient DNA survives longest. They worked in sterile clean rooms, sequencing fragments and assembling them like a shattered mosaic, piece by piece, until a genome emerged. And when they plotted those genomes on a principal components analysis, a statistical map where genetically similar populations cluster together, the result was, in Berger's words, a surprise. The Zagros farmers did not cluster with the Anatolian farmers who later spread into Europe. They did not cluster with European hunter-gatherers. They formed their own distinct genetic island, plotting closest to modern-day Pakistanis and Afghans. Before we see what this evidence reveals about Kurdish origins, if you're finding this discovery as fascinating as we are, subscribe so you don't miss future stories like this one. The separation between these two farming populations, Zagros and Anatolian, was not recent. It predated the invention of farming itself. Berger's team estimated the two lineages had diverged more than 50,000 years ago. Two groups of humans, living on opposite ends of the same Fertile Crescent, looking different, speaking different languages, invented agriculture independently, almost simultaneously. The Zagros people were not a branch of the Anatolian tree. They were a parallel trunk. A companion study, led by researchers at University College Dublin, sequenced the genome of a woman from Ganj Dareh, a Neolithic site high in the central Zagros, with the world's earliest evidence for goat domestication. She lived roughly 10,000 years ago. She had black hair and brown eyes. She was lactose intolerant. Her mitochondrial DNA placed her in haplogroup X. And genetically, she was most similar not to any ancient farmer from Anatolia or the Levant, but to hunter-gatherers from the Caucasus Mountains, hundreds of kilometers to the north. Her people made almost no direct genetic contribution to modern Europeans. They were, in the words of the study, somewhat isolated from other populations of the Fertile Crescent. And yet, the modern population that preserves the most of her ancient ancestry is not Pakistani, not Afghan. It is the Zoroastrians of Iran, a religious community that, through endogamy, avoided mixing with later waves of migrants. The implication is stark. The deepest genetic layer in the Kurdish mountains predates every empire, every migration, every language family that scholars have used to define the Kurds. Now, 3 pieces of evidence lock this into place. First, what the data shows. The J2 haplogroup, dominant in Kurdish men, traces directly to these Neolithic Zagros populations. The G2A lineage, found in roughly 11% of Sorani Kurds, is associated with the spread of agriculture from eastern Anatolia. Together, these Neolithic origin lineages account for the majority of Kurdish paternal DNA. The R1A1 component, the Indo-European marker, is a later addition, a minority layer deposited on top of something far older. Second, what it rules out. The data eliminates the possibility that the Kurds are primarily descended from steppe migrants who brought Iranian languages westward. If the Medes had replaced the local Zagros population, R1A1 would dominate. It does not. If they had even contributed equally, it would approach 50%. It sits at 12. The genetic signature of the Indo-European migration into Kurdistan is real, but it is the signature of an elite, not a population replacement. Military rulers who imposed their language on a people who were already there, who had been there for millennia. Third, what it implies. A study by Ariella Oppenheim and Almut Nabel at the Hebrew University analyzed 526 Y chromosomes from 6 Middle Eastern populations and found that Jews were genetically closer to Kurds, Turks, and Armenians, the peoples of the northern Fertile Crescent, than to their Arab neighbors. The common genetic background, the study concluded, predates the ethnogenesis of any of these groups. It reaches back to a shared Neolithic ancestor pool, a population that existed before anyone was called Kurdish, Jewish, or Armenian. Before there were names for these people, there was a genetic community in the northern arc of the Fertile Crescent, and the Kurds are its most direct surviving heirs. But the picture splits further when you look at the maternal line. A study by Ivan Nasidze and Mark Stoneking at the Max Planck Institute analyzed mitochondrial DNA from Kurdish groups in Turkey and Georgia. The father's lines pointed toward the Caucasus and West Asia. The mother's lines pointed somewhere else entirely, toward Europe. Kurdish maternal DNA showed closer affinity with European populations than with Caucasus groups, while paternal DNA showed the opposite. The mothers and fathers came from different worlds. This is the signature of sex-biased migration. Indo-European-speaking groups, predominantly male warrior bands, entered the Kurdish mountains over centuries, starting around 2000 BC. They married local women. They imposed their language. They became the aristocracy of kingdoms like Mitanni and later the Median Empire. But the women, the mothers, carried a different genetic memory, one that connected the mountains to the west, to Anatolia, and ultimately to Europe. The Kurdish genome is not a single story. It is at least 2 stories, layered on top of each other, told by different chromosomes. And beneath both of those layers lies something even older. The scholar Mehrdad Izadi, one of the world's foremost authorities on Kurdish history, has argued that the deepest cultural substratum of Kurdish identity is not Median, not Indo-European at all, but Hurrian. The Hurrians, a non-Indo-European people who spoke a language related to modern Chechen and Lezgian, dominated the Kurdish mountains from roughly 3000 to 1200 BC. Izadi has documented that nearly 3/4 of Kurdish clan names and roughly half of Kurdish place names, from the river Murad to the city of Mardin to the lake of Van, are Hurrian in origin. Their religious symbols survive in Yazidi and Alevi traditions. Their tattooing motifs still appear on Kurdish bodies. Some geneticists dispute the Hurrian connection as insufficiently supported by ancient DNA, noting that no Hurrian-era genome has yet been sequenced from the Kurdish mountains. Without that direct comparison, the link between modern Kurdish haplogroups and the Bronze Age Hurrians remains circumstantial. Others argue that the Halaf culture, a distinctive and remarkably sophisticated pottery tradition that unified the Kurdish mountains around 6000 BC, represents the true Proto-Kurdish substrate. The Halaf spread rapidly across a vast mountainous terrain, from the Kabur River in Syria to the foothills of the Zagros, suggesting a mobile herding economy and a population with shared identity. It is the earliest archaeological evidence of a unified cultural expression across the region. Still others point out that even the Neolithic genetic layer may not be monolithic. that different valleys and highland zones may have harbored distinct but related populations whose mixing over millennia created the Kurdish gene pool we see today. The debate is unresolved and may remain so until ancient DNA is extracted from Halaf-era and Hurrian-era burials, something no team has yet accomplished. But what is resolved is that the oldest genetic layer in Kurdistan belongs to the Neolithic, not the Iron Age. The forbidden chapter of Kurdish DNA is this. The world's largest stateless nation, nearly 40 million people, carries in its chromosomes the genetic legacy of humanity's first farmers, a population so old it diverged from the rest of Eurasia before the last ice age ended. They were given a new language by conquerors. They were given a new origin story by linguists. But their DNA remembers what the textbooks forgot. Today, a joint project between Soran University in Kurdistan and the University of Huddersfield in England, led by geneticist Martin Richards, is working to build the first comprehensive genetic map of Kurdish populations. Hundreds of DNA samples are being collected across Kurdistan. The ancient genomes are being compared with modern ones. The full picture is still emerging. If this hidden chapter of history intrigued you, subscribe to explore more mysteries, because the evidence is only now revealing. But consider what we already know. In the High Zagros, at a site called Ganj Dare, a woman was buried 10,000 years ago among the bones of the first domesticated goats on Earth. She had never heard an Indo-European word. She did not know the Medes would come. She did not know that one day scholars would argue about whether her descendants existed. But her genome survived. And when it was finally read, it did not match the story we told about her people. So here is the question that remains. If the Kurds are not who the textbooks said they were, if their roots reach back not 3,000 but 10,000 years in the same mountains, what else have we gotten wrong about the peoples of the ancient Near East and whose origin story is the next one to fall?